Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever this finds you across the globe. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, and I am delighted to welcome you to the next in our ongoing series of webinar conversations under the broader title, The Quest for Community. In today's conversation, we are going to be looking at loneliness and political life and understand this as a transatlantic conversation and the first one of these that we have ever hosted. And I'm delighted to partner with Iona Lawrence and her team of friends and colleagues as we come to understand that the issues that we've been exploring here through our Quest for Community series are not simply challenges to American policy and politics, that this is in fact a Western problem. I'm going to stop my screen share and welcome you in here. Coming to you live from the Dean's Conference Room on the campus of Pepperdine University in Southern California. Iona and I thought it might be a good place to start to give you a little bit of background, both to this series and our interest in co-hosting this transatlantic conversation. The Quest for Community series grows out of an initiative here at the Graduate Policy School called the American Project, one that was initiated shortly after the 2016 election in 2017 to explore the future of the American conservative movement. As part of those conversations, we hosted our first gathering of 40 academics, activists, scholars, and policymakers here on our Malibu campus in June of 2017 to continue and in some cases initiate conversations around the future of conservatism, understanding that there had been quite a polarization even on the right as to what would be the future principles of policy and politics on the right. Where we resolved at the end of a long weekend together here on the campus was utterly unexpected for where we ended up, even though we had people from a variety of perspectives, was that the challenges facing American political culture were not so much political, but cultural. And to be specific about it, the cultural challenge that we as a group came together as a consensus to agree upon was that the major challenge we were facing was one of loneliness or social isolation. Now, remember, this was in the spring of 2017, well before COVID and the pandemic, but we understood even then that the tribalization that we were seeing in our politics was a logical outgrowth of people who were finding or having difficulty finding other forms of connection or developing other forms of community with one another. That had led, that understanding that our challenges in the United States, especially in our public square, especially around issues of politics and policy, were again founded in culture and loneliness, led to a series of conferences, writing at the website Real Clear Policy, and webinars like this one, The Quest for Community. Now, of course, the challenges that we saw back in 2017 have only been exacerbated by the pandemic, as we've now come to understand in new ways across all demographic categories, the feelings and perceptions of loneliness and social isolation that have been brought about by the pandemic. Now, to get specific about it and to explore the topic for today's conversation, the reason we're interested in loneliness as a cultural concept is that it does have an impact, and we're seeing increasingly the influence of social isolation on our policy and politics. One of the essays that we had commissioned for this series at Real Clear Policy, and I'll post the link here in the chat feature in a second, was written by one of the advisors to the American Project, Dr. Ryan Streeter, who is the Director of Domestic Policy at the American Enterprise Institute based in Washington, D.C. He wrote a piece called The Lonely Political Crowd, in which he analyzed data from the very comprehensive survey of community and society. And by combining that with the University of California at Los Angeles's loneliness scale, was able to write this when looking at the connection between loneliness and civic engagement. Now, what he found was that unlike other areas of civic engagement, engagement in your church, engagement in your local community, engagement in civil society, business organizations, for example, was that political engagement and purely political engagement actually exacerbated levels of loneliness. He wrote this in the piece, and I quote, "By contrast, active members of political organizations have an average loneliness score 2 points higher than the national average. It's the only volunteering activity to register above the national average. In addition, the survey finds that socially active yet lonely, yes, it is possible to be both, young adults ages 18 to 35 are 7 times more likely to volunteer in politics than their socially active peers who are not lonely." He went on to say this, and I quote, "Lacking regular community, political joiners compensate ideologically. 87% report that their ideology gives them a sense of community, compared to 63% of ordinary Americans. They also derive a stronger sense of community from people or groups on social media than the general population, 62% versus 48%. And they tend to lean further left and are more highly educated than the general population. These are the only 2 meaningful demographic factors. Otherwise, their race, gender, age, employment, or marital status look like the general population." So again, the reason that we take interest in this at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine is that we understand that a term of art that can be seen as rather squishy, to use an American term, one that is tough in some ways to quantify, is now becoming increasingly quantifiable. And this disconnection between hyper-political engagement and broader civic engagement is one that is worth exploring. And as I said before, it's an issue that we're seeing not only here in the United States, but across the pond. And so that's why we're so delighted to partner with Iona Lawrence and her great work there in the UK. And so without further ado, Iona, I'll turn it over to you to begin today's conversation.
Thank you, that's really kind. And thank you to you and Melissa and your whole team for hosting today. And to our mutual friends, who I'm not sure they're going to be here. I knew they were hoping to make it, but More in Common introduced us about 6 months ago. So I'm just going to say a few things over the next few minutes, and then we're going to hand over to our much more exciting panelists. A bit about me: I'm a coalition builder and campaigner. I set up the foundation for Joe Cox, who was a politician here in the UK, murdered just before the Brexit referendum by a far-right extremist back in 2016. In her memory, we campaigned to appoint the world's first Minister for Loneliness, amongst a range of work rooted in her belief that we have more in common than that which divides us, which is a refrain that has come to define not just her life, but also her legacy. Today, I have the privilege of working with non-profits, the public sector, philanthropy and businesses on all things loneliness and, more importantly, social connection. And today I'm wearing my associate hat for the Relationships Project, which is a small team of people on a mission to make it easier for every organisation, service and place to put good relationships at the heart of what they do. So I'd encourage you all to be as active as you feel like in the chat as we go. We'll collate your questions and comments and come back to them for a substantial Q&A session at the end of this, but don't hold back. And if you've got things that you'd like to share, please do put them in the chat as we go. So just to add to Pete's really excellent introduction from the US, how does this look from the UK? So in an age of seemingly so much connection, it's easy to mistake how connected we are with connecting well. Here in the UK, loneliness, as we know, has been a long-term issue, but particularly exacerbated by COVID in many ways. 1 in 4 adults here felt they had no friends during lockdown and worried that something would happen to them and no one would notice. And as Pete said in the US, we too reflect here that 16 to 24-year-olds are much more likely than their older neighbours often to feel lonely. And there are lots of implications of this, including the health implications. Well catalogued is that loneliness is as bad for us as 15 cigarettes a day. But the focus of today's conversation is that running alongside this, there's also social division. Here in the UK, 1 in 3 Brits don't have a friend from a different racial or ethnic background, similar estimates for class. And then running alongside that, we've got our relationship with political life and participation in democracy. Increasing numbers of Brits report feeling democracy as a site of confrontation, not compromise, and verbal and physical attacks are on the rise. New research out from our mutual friends More in Common in the UK yesterday revealed that 84% of Brits believe politicians don't care what they think. So if inequality cuts us out and off from society's gains, its bedfellows are loneliness and social division who cut us out and off from one another. So do they offer a partial but potent explanation for why our politics have become much more polarised? I'll say one final thing before we hand over. Don't worry, today is not just about despair. I am a big fan of Vivek Murthy, whose book on loneliness I think is excellent. And in it he says, perhaps the story of loneliness could be a story of hope because it's a call for us to connect. Loneliness reveals the power of human connection and the extraordinary power of that connection to heal. So I'm delighted to bring together 3 incredible speakers who I've learned lots from in the last few years and stretch across the political spectrum in the UK to share their perceptions of these big ranging questions. First up is John Yates, who heads up the Youth Endowment Fund in the UK and is also author of the highly recommended book Fractured, Why Our Societies Are Coming Apart and How We Can Put Them Back Together. The fact that loneliness is on the rise seems to be a function, in part, of the wasting away of intermediary institutions in civil society. We also have smaller families, fraying communities, closing churches. You know the story really, and this is one that John is very well acquainted with. To borrow Robert Putnam's phrase, we've been bowling alone for decades. So John is here to share a bit about where he sees loneliness impact on political life, and crucially how his sort of imagined common life, a reinvigoration of common life, could build a better public life. Over to you, John, and thank you very much for being here.
Iona, thanks so much for having me, and Peter, thank you very much, and Melissa for organising everything. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. I suddenly sound really, really English, even to myself, as I speak to you all. The core thing I want to just provoke us with is, what is the impact, not just of a more lonely society, but if as we lose connection with each other, we find that the few connections that remain tend to be with people who are remarkably like us. What does that do for our politics and for our democracy? I'm going to read only twice, 2 little bits from the book, and I'm going to have one at the beginning, one at the end, but I'll keep them very brief, but I think they're little helpful sort of bookends. This is one little bit. Afghanistan, Colombia, Iraq, Sudan, and Somalia. The stamps in Keith Mines' passport tell you that he knows a thing or two about civil war. Working for the UN, the US Army Special Forces and the US State Department, he has served in countries and regions plagued by violent division. In March 2017, Mines was asked by Foreign Affairs magazine to focus his attention on a country he knows well and estimate the chances of a civil war breaking out in the next decade and a half. With a heavy heart, he put the odds at 60%. The country in question was the United States of America. why does this lack of connection matter from the point of view of democracy? Well, the fundamental answer to that comes to, what does the word democracy mean? My parents had a misspent adulthood teaching classics. And so they would absolutely want me to point out the word democracy means power to the people. Demos means the people. You need a set of the people, a set of us, for democracy to work. Why? That's a nice linguistic trick. Why? What's the evidence of that? Well, first of all, democracy works really badly if we don't have an understanding of the country that we live in. In the UK, once every 4 or 5 years, there are no members of parliament. They're all chucked out. And I get to enter what tends to be some sort of community hall with a little stubby pencil. We don't use machines. A little stubby pencil, and mark who I want to be in charge. And for that moment, we are the government. You know, we get to say what should be happening, or at least who should be in charge. But that requires some degree of understanding of what the country is like and what people's lives are like to try and make that decision well. Unfortunately, in a society where we're more lonely, when we're more divided, we don't really know the country very well. So let's take the Netherlands. 1 in 3, the average Dutch person thinks that 1 in 3, a third of Dutch people, think that homosexuality is immoral. So the average Dutch person thinks 1 in 3 of their fellow countrymen have that view. Totally wrong. 1 in 20 have that view. Canadians, when asked how many Canadians are happy, underestimate the number of happy Canadians by 50%. And the Canadians are the best at making this guess. We all think all our fellow citizens are utterly miserable, when actually they're not. The Brits are appallingly bad at estimating the proportion of the population of Muslim faith. We overestimate the number of Muslims by 300%. I'm afraid you wonderful Americans are even worse. You overestimate it by 1,000%. Half of British people who are not Muslim have never had any contact at all with anyone who's a Muslim. We just have very little understanding of what's going on. We overestimate unemployment by 300 or 400%. We overestimate teenage pregnancy by 1,000%. Even at sort of very basic questions, we don't have a very good understanding of things. So if I take some of the richest people, let's go to Australia. Let's take the group of Australians who earn double the average income. They're doing pretty well. A third of those people, almost half, a third of those people think that they are average income. It should be really obvious they're not. They're double the average income. It's a really easy question. Where are you roughly? You should be able to just look around and just tell whether you're average or not. And they do look around. But all the people they see when they look around earn about the same amount that they do. And the same is true at the other end of the income spectrum. Over half of poor Australians think they're about average. And again, we're looking around and we're seeing people like us. How can our democracy function well if it's relying on my understanding of what people's lives are like when I don't know most of the people's lives who live in my country? In the beginning of the 20th century, there were 2 rich young men who had been educated in very expensive private schools here in the UK. And they lived a very wonderful existence surrounded by people who were also incredibly well off. And they left university. They'd been to Oxford University, and they left and they moved to London. And they moved to the East End of London. And they moved into one of the poorest parts of the East End of London, and they lived in what was called a settlement house, which was a house where they would try and serve the local community. Those 2 men found their eyes massively opened by the fact that their social network had changed dramatically. I'm not saying these became deep friendships, but they had an insight as to how the average British person lived before the Second World War. And those 2 men, after the Second World War, became the fundamental individuals, or 2 of the fundamental individuals in the creation of our healthcare system, which you'll find Brits are incredibly, I'm the sort of right of centre panelist here. Even those of us who are conservatives are amazingly proud of our alleged socialised medicine. The NHS created because Clement Attlee was one of those gentlemen who spent that time with people very much unlike him and realised the needs of poor Brits. And the other man was a man called William Beveridge, who designed the welfare state, that again the British people think is both completely ineffective and wonderful, and so, or essential at least. And so the two main changes that happened in our country came from people getting out of their little, relatively lonely bubbles. We have to understand each other for democracy to work. We have to do more than understand each other, though. We have to have some trust in each other. Democracy is known by a far dirtier word, which is compromise. Ultimately, democracy works by some degree of compromise in the city between ourselves. It is phenomenally difficult to compromise if we feel that we are us and them rather than us. There's a phenomenal piece of research that was done here in the United, or where you are in the United States, where they looked at different parts of the country to what extent people's neighborhoods were mixing with people who were different from themselves. And particularly they looked at the level to which the area was ethnically diverse but not connecting. And they found that the areas that were more socially divided, when it came to actually being prepared to pay for a public good, for something that might benefit the local community, the average amount people were prepared to pay was $100 per person less. That meant that's 2/3 the policing budget. This is a significant amount of money. So when it comes to trying to convince people to actually pay for bridges, for roads, for infrastructure, loneliness and disconnection is poisonous to our ability to move forward and to progress. But finally, why is loneliness so problematic for democracy? I said about understanding the country. I've said about trust. Maybe it'd be good if we just got everyone together and they just talked more. We need to talk, because democracy requires discussion and debate. Maybe we talk more. The problem is, unfortunately, in our little groups, talking makes it worse. In fact, the evidence is the more we talk with those we know about politics, the more convinced we become that we and the people around us are right. And so if we live in little bubbles, so let me give some little facts to back this up. If we look in the US to start with, 2/3 of people who would describe themselves as committed conservatives only have friends who are also committed conservatives. Half of those who define themselves as committed liberals only have friends who are committed liberals. The UK is not much better. 1/4 of those who voted to leave the EU only have friends who voted to leave. 1/4 of those who voted to remain only have friends who voted to remain. We see the same divides by ethnicity. Half of Brits have no friends from a different ethnic group. Half of graduates have almost no friends who didn't go to university. The vast majority of pensioners don't know anyone under the age of 35 apart from their grandchildren, or don't have contact with them. The greatest divide in the UK remains wealth. So a UK barrister would have to invite around 100 people to their house, 100 people, before they would be likely to accidentally invite someone who is unemployed. If we talk to people about politics, but they tend to have the same views as us, we just become more convinced that we're right all along, and the us is right and the them is wrong. Conservative students who join fraternities that are mostly conservative become more convinced that the only way to look at the world is through a conservative lens. Liberal judges sitting on a panel with other liberal judges become more liberal in their decision making. When we discuss politics with people like us, we become less able to make democracy work. I'll close with one final bit from the book that Iona mentioned. This is partly stolen from a great man, Bill Bishop. We are living with the consequences of a great segregation, pockets of like-minded citizens that have become so ideologically inbred that we don't know, can't understand, and can barely conceive of those people who live just a few miles away. A segregated society lacks a common political consensus. Presidential candidates often lament the lack of leaders, as if entire generations of Americans were born without the skills of a Johnson, an FDR, or a Dwight Eisenhower. There are, of course, just as many leaders as there's always been. What the country is missing is old-fashioned followers. The problem, I would argue, with our democracy is not our leaders, though I suspect we would like some other options at times. The problem is us, the people. And what we must find is new ways to connect us together out of our loneliness, out of our bubbles, with people who think and see the world in a different way from ourselves. Thank you very much, Raina.
Thank you, John. Highly recommend giving his book a read, and also he's been doing a very good line in podcasts recently, so found on a podcast near you is a potted version of his vision for a country with a common life. So we're now on to Ruth, who I listening to you, John, I think Ruth's gonna have some things to say about some of the things you said. So Ruth has founded a number of award-winning organisations that all begin with R. I'm assured that it's not kind of intentional. Reclaim, the Roots Programme and Rekindle Academy. And at the heart of her work lies a lot of things, but one of them is her belief in the all too often overlooked capacity of young people to lead, bridge and heal division, challenge perceptions and change the world. She's also just really, really fabulous human. So thank you for joining us, Ruth. For you, I think you're going to share with us a bit about where you've seen loneliness impact on political life, but also with your kind of serial founder hat, it would be great to hear a bit about how you've learned what role relationships can play in helping and supporting young people to have a stake in democracy and shape the future of their country. So over to you, Ruth.
Hello, thank you, Iona. Hello, everyone. Really interesting. I've just finished listening to your book, John. And I liked and agreed with most of it. So actually, we're on pretty much the same page. And I love working with Iona, so I said yes immediately to being here. I've been given a brief as to what I'm to talk about. And in typical way, as soon as I listen to the first speaker, I then want to go down a load of different avenues. So I promise I'll bring it back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. But when I heard what this was about and loneliness, you know, we think about individuals, but a bit like John, I'm slightly obsessed with place and communities. And I want to share a little bit about my own background and a little bit about some of the work that I've done, because it leads into some of that. I am from the north of England, so I also sound very, very English, but a very different type of English. So I'm from the north of England in a place called Bradford. And this is a city that I love deeply, but it's been very unloved, forgotten, disadvantaged over the years. It's a city that people know for negative reasons. We're famous for tragedy. We're famous for religious and racial infighting and riots. We've been underfunded. Various governments have not loved us. And we're the kind of place that filmmakers turn up to make a hard-hitting, gritty documentary about something and shame us even further. Historically, the media have shone us through shone a lens of disadvantage to a point where people don't feel pride of coming from this area. Politicians have not been interested really, and there's been a massive lack of funding in our area. What that means is, as an area, we look inward, we become quite chippy about the way other people see us, and we feel lonely. We see other areas being funded. We see other areas getting the investment. We see leaders coming from other areas, but not from places like ours. And what happens is the people who talk about areas like ours are not from there. The academics, the politicians, the media, they come and they look at us and they examine us and they talk about us, but they are not of us. This leads to a really unhealthy sense of a relationship between a place and politics. You know, the politics around my city in many ways was quiet managed decline for a lot of years. You know, it was just seen that we would be the area that would absorb and decline, and eventually, you know, no one had any expectations. And growing up, I was always told the best thing you can do is to move away. You know, you're a bright girl, move away. This place is not for you. And I know there's many cities in America where the same thing must be going on. I'm now a mum and I have a 3-year-old. And for anyone who's a parent out there, you know that if you ignore your child for long enough, it will disrupt. It will disrupt, it will make a loud noise. You cannot starve anyone, any human being, of love and attention and connection. Because if you do it for too long, they will disrupt and they will make themselves seen and heard. And I believe, not that I'm saying that communities are like my toddler, but at the same time, they are completely. And I think what's happened a lot of the time in the UK, and what's probably happened in the US as well, is that communities that have been forgotten and felt lonely, when they've been given the opportunity, as John was talking about at the ballot box, to disrupt and to be seen and heard, they've jumped into that opportunity. We need to understand that people need to feel connected, they need to feel seen, they need to feel loved, they need to feel the warmth of the whole. And without that, they will always, in some ways, either disappear or disrupt. So how does this kind of connect to policy? Well, for us, obviously, you know, we have Brexit and we're still living with Brexit. And what's really interesting for me was that at the time of Brexit, I was living in a very working class community in the north of England, very white working class community, an area where I didn't really know my neighbours, and we all kept ourselves to ourselves and did what we needed to do. On the morning of the Brexit vote, and I've spoken about this before, but on the morning of the Brexit vote, I was woken up at about 5 o'clock in the morning by my neighbours doing a conga dance down the road. Several of the guys were dancing down the road and shouting Happy Independence Day. And I gone to sleep that night thinking I knew what the result was going to be, looked out of my window and realised that something pretty fundamental had changed in my neighbourhood that was a forgotten part of the north of England. What was really interesting was that was probably the greatest day on my road. People were talking to each other, people were engaging, people were happy. They had disrupted, and disrupted effectively. And there were no cameras to see the joy and jubilation on my road that day, but it was a real sense of shift and change. And people who before had felt forgotten and unloved and invisible felt in that moment seen. Because of my work, 3 days later, I was speaking at a conference in London, and it was the Bransons were there. It was a very, very prestigious thing, and I was talking about my charitable work, and the topic of Brexit came up, and the absolute derision in the room for anyone who'd voted Brexit, and those idiots in those communities, and those idiots in the north, and those morons. And I just thought, wow, here we are, kind of 200 miles apart, with two groups of people who distrust and dislike each other intensely, and yet know absolutely nothing of each other. The people who lived on my road, many of them have probably never even been to London, the people that they say that they dislike so much. And those people who were sat there in London so angry and so upset about the way the vote had gone, I knew damn well that they'd probably never spent time breaking bread with people like the people who I lived among. So from that, I started an organisation called Roots. And Roots was very much about how do we have genuine cultural exchange between people who are different? Moving on from what John said, the problem is when you get people just to talk to each other, they just tend to reinforce, but they're not talking to people of difference. How do we get people to have parity, to have genuine cultural connections with people who are different to themselves, to listen, to stop talking for a while, to listen authentically, to understand that no one really will go out there and try and change their lives for the worse, to understand that people care about the future of their children, but the future of their children might be different to what you want for the future of your own children, and to listen, to understand people's choices, to dial down the toxicity that was going on, just to dial it down and to have people understand we are a tiny island in the scheme of things, and yet we have no idea about how people live in lives that are different to our own. And so instead we have so much judgment about them. So Roots is very much about how do we get people from entirely different socioeconomic, political, cultural backgrounds to spend time with each other, to visit each other's houses, to meet each other's families, to break bread together, to talk about things, and to suspend some of that judgment, it's not about rich people going to visit poor people and making judgments. No, it's about just looking at the different choices that people have made in their lives and understanding why, and asking questions. When did we lose our natural curiosity to actually ask questions? Well, why did you do that? Oh, I don't understand. That's not a loaded question. And I find that so often there's so little curiosity about people who are different to ourselves. So we've got all this commentary going on about people in society and so little curiosity. So Roots is very much about how do we build connection and compassion and curiosity? How do I learn from someone whose life is different to mine? And how do I get them to see that their choices are valid and my choices are also valid, and to see where they're coming from? So that's me in a nutshell, kind of some of the work that I do. I mean, I only mentioned that I do a lot of work with young people. And the final thing I want to mention is that when we talk about loneliness, quite often we imagine someone who's old. And in actual fact, there was a Children's Society report published in 2014 that said that children in England were the unhappiest in Europe. We are one of the richest countries in the world, and we have the unhappiest children in our continent. And that is because a lot of our children feel utterly disconnected. Their means of connection, that common ground, that common space that John talks about, has been eroded. They don't have a place to meet. They don't have places to talk. They're forced onto social media. And that, in many ways, is making them more and more unhappy. When that report came out, I saw the news and thought, this is it. This is a seismic moment where the UK says, right, let's do better by our children. Let's look after them. Our children are unhappy. No one wants that for their vulnerable kids. Literally 2 days later, it had moved off of the news. And that was one of the saddest professional moments of my life, that we didn't really put in place some huge changes to look at how we can connect our young people better and how we can listen to their unhappiness levels. So I'm also hoping to learn from a lot of the stuff that we've got going on here as to what we can do for the next generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. That was fab. And we're now going to finish with Naz Morley. So Ian, in the questions at one point recently said, asked a question about, is there anything to be said about what makes groups able to live side by side? And Naz works for an organisation that, along with people like Ruth's organisations, are doing exactly that. I personally am obsessed with relationships because they elicit core emotional reactions that we've heard all too much on this conversation already of the opposite of. So good relationships elicit feelings of belonging, of security, of safety, of feeling cared for, of feeling supported, feeling understood, purposeful, valued, respected, seen, and yes, loved. I think we should talk about love more in these spaces. And this is an organisation, the Cares Family, that Naz will tell you more about, that does exactly that. So it's an award-winning UK-based charity that knows a thing or two about what it takes to grow connections, bridging divides and growing connections in some of the UK's fastest changing cities. They do bridge intergenerational divides, but that's just the beginning of it. They are working in kind of big, like rapidly changing, gentrifying often city centres and bits of our cities. And they're doing the brilliant work of working out what you can do to bring people together, to burst bubbles. So Naz, over to you with all of your experience there, but also beyond that in banking and social entrepreneurship and everything else. Would be great to hear a few of your reflections to finish this off before we move into questions.
Yeah, thank you, Iona, and thanks for bringing this together. Thanks, Peter, and lovely to meet you, John and Ruth. I suppose where I wanted to start is kind of what I feel about loneliness. And I often ask myself, can you feel lonely if you have friends, family, people around you? And this is where I see the intersection between loneliness and connection, because my answer I come back to myself with is yes, because you can still be in a group of people and feel utterly disconnected. And someone earlier was talking about, physical loneliness versus social isolation versus connection. And there's a nuance in the slight differences between those. You can be, in a group of people and physically not be lonely, but you can feel lonely because you don't feel connected to those people. And I'll probably populate what I'm talking about with personal stories, because it's what I do. I tell stories. The example I wanted to give you is when I was growing up, a second generation Asian immigrant. My parents came here in the late 60s, and my parents had just moved to a borough on the borders of East London and Essex called Wanstead, which was incredibly white then. And we were literally the only brown faces in the village. And it wasn't a warm welcome, I won't pretend, but I settled into primary school quite well. I was good at what Ruth talked about earlier, asking questions, because I'm naturally incredibly nosy about people's lives. So I would make friends through lots of asking questions. But no one really looked like me. No one really came home to a home life like me. And no one really wanted to know about my culture. So no one asked me questions. And even the teachers were slightly dismissive. And asked me if I'd like to be known as Natalie. My full name is Nassim, which I promptly said no. But that my loneliness there was that feeling disconnected and having to assimilate to fit in. And that's where my loneliness came from. And those prejudices I faced were about people not understanding who we were and not knowing about how we live. We were different and we were not connected into our community where we lived. And in my head, that felt lonely. So I wasn't physically lonely. I had a big family, we saw the weekends, but I felt a bit isolated from the people I went to school with and the people I lived around. And when things started to really change is when, this is when I talk about local high streets a lot and how the demise of local high streets have been breaking up our communities, I start to think about when things changed for us locally. And it was the point that my mum got a job in Woolies. Now, for those of you who are British and old enough, like myself, you will remember the great British institution of Woolworths. And there started our bridging the divide on culture and religion, because my mum worked on the cash desk every day, 9 till 1, which was the key time when lots of the local residents and older residents used to come in. And they warmed to her. She's very warm and friendly, and they chatted to her and they began to ask her questions about where she was from. And I would say that within a couple of years of mum working there, we could not get down our high street, which would take about 5 minutes. It usually took us an average of about 40 minutes because the amount of people that would stop and talk to her. And through that, she grew the confidence to start wearing Asian clothes, to start bringing Asian food in sometimes for her friends. And we started to fit in. And why? Because people had started to ask questions and had started to understand who we were. And it was that connection. Connection is about building relationships. It's not just about talking. It's like Ruth said, it's about listening and understanding. And actually later, I too took on this family tradition and got my Saturday job in Woolies, dream job, working on the record counter. And I found myself working with a couple of women who were in their 50s. And I say that, oh my God, in their 50s. Now I find myself in my 50s. But to me, they were my mum's age. And I thought, well, there's no way I would know how to connect with these people. But because I worked with them, they weren't mums at work. They were just two women that I had a load in common with. We became really great friends. And I suddenly realized that, oh my God, it is possible to have a relationship with someone who not only looks different, sounds different, but is 35 years older than me. And, you know, opened my mind. So I have a lot to be grateful to Woolworths for. But what I'm talking about is how that connection leads to understanding. And that's how we, when we start to understand people, how we can bridge those, that political divide and more importantly, those intolerances. And I think someone talked about not wanting this all to be bad news. Well, I think some of the good news that we've got is, although we know we are in this darkness of loneliness and disconnection, the good news is that COVID and lockdown has actually started to bring some communities together. And I think 31% of public are saying that they know their neighbours better now in a recent report that was put together by the Cares family and Power to Change. And I know Iona's going to share that in the chat, hopefully. But that has not been the same experience across the UK. And I too am passionate about place, which I know John and Ruth are. And we saw 44% of people saying that in London, but yet only 25% in the Northeast. And I asked myself, is there a pattern between that and those people feeling disconnected and those forgotten places that Ruth talked about? Those post-industrial towns, those coastal towns where years of underinvestment have seen huge increases in social and economic hardship and have bred those intolerances. And, you know, we know from history that when people feel powerless, when people are living at times of desperation, deprivation, they are more likely to listen to and to be influenced by the voices that seem to offer them some form of hope, and to make them feel like they belong. And potentially those that are seeking more polarization and those that are seeking to galvanate people behind extremism. So when loneliness and disconnection has a bigger impact on society across political divides and huge risks to those. And when we start to see that polarization is when we start to breed that lack of trust, that lack of empathy. When we start to only talk to those that look and sound like us, we don't share those political, cultural and social views and ideas, and we become quite fixated on, locked in our own ideas, almost defending them to ourselves and fiercely defensive of them and telling ourselves that this is the right way to think because those people around me think that way. So how do we start breaking that cycle? Well, I know John talked about places, and in your book you talk about, you know, having these centres, these places that people can come together to meet. But I think we need to take it a step further. We need to think about how we create the opportunities in those places for meaningful contact across divides, across mixed communities. We need to think about natural opportunities. So where are the women on the checkout and the men on the checkout in the Woolies today? That where are those people that we go to that high street and we see the same person in that shop and we can have that chat and it makes us feel connected to where we live. But part of what we see is we're seeing a growth in events pre-COVID and fairs and local community events. But are we seeing those mixed across our community? And for that to change, we need that power to be put in the hands of those in those communities, for them to curate the things that actually make sense to their own communities. They need to own them. We need to give support. Central government needs to give support, funding, but I don't think it's about you know, those initiatives coming from a central place. And I think it is about creating that sense of belonging to everyone in that community across those perceived lines of difference. It's about engaging in meaningful conversation and understanding our differences and unearthing some of those similarities at the same time. We don't have to agree on anything, but it's healthy to talk about it, ask questions, as Ruth says. And it's interesting, but I kind of, in my head, I see it as that changing the narrative on what is us. What does us mean to people? What does us look like? You know, to me, is us a group of, you know, Asian women? To someone else is us a group of Jewish people. To someone else is us a group of young people. Or can it be all those things? You know, and can us be actually a collection of the people you live near, your street, your community? And I, you know, in my romantic view, I want it to be all those things to people. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about what the Cares family is doing and what their solutions are. We've talked about across different social, racial divides. The Cares family is particularly right now looking at intergenerational division. And if we look at a key trend of the 2019 election, one of the biggest divisions we saw was on age, with younger and more city dwellers really focused on Remainer values and older people leaning more towards Brexit values. Now, I'm not making a black and white distinction here, but it was a trend we saw and a trend that continues. And even pre-pandemic, we also saw the differences in older people and younger people growing through things like globalization, through digitization, through a more open society, discussing things like gender and race, and leaving some older people behind, not because they're necessarily intolerant, but they're not part of the conversation. I've got a neighbour who says to me, everything's changing so fast. He's in his 70s. And it's not that I don't agree with anyone, but I just don't understand. No one really talks to me. I don't have access to social media, because he doesn't do online, as he says. It doesn't necessarily make him intolerant, perhaps a little ignorant, but I found him to be extremely tolerant and inclusive after I take the time to include him in my conversations and talk to him about what he calls the modern world. And the Cares family are seeking to bridge those divides across older and younger people, helping them to find that connection, and not just by hiring a hall and saying, well, we're here, come and see us, but through creating time and space for younger and older people to share life stories, to enjoy activities together, to visit each other, to talk on the phone. And that's what I talk about when I talk about meaningful relationships. And if we look at the effect of older and younger people and loneliness, well, if we look at young people, and we were talking before how people assume that loneliness is about older people. In April 2020, so we're hitting lockdown, 35% of young people reported feeling lonely and depressed. And in November 2020, it was over half. And in our new report that we've just produced with Power to Change, new polling suggests that 9 in 10 18 to 34-year-olds experienced feeling loneliness during the pandemic. So it isn't just older people. And we really see that the work that we are doing to bring older and younger people together at the Cares family is helping to break boundaries across those perceived lines of difference, across racism, gender, ethnicity, sexism. And how do we do that? Well, I'll give you 3 examples. We create social clubs. And those social clubs are for younger and old people to come together to do something they enjoy. Now, that might be a desert island discs night. It might be storytelling. It might be quizzes. But what it is, and really importantly, it's about younger and older people coming together. And it's not younger people hosting older people or vice versa. Sometimes they will run those clubs themselves. We put the power in their hands. We do outreach where we identify and invite older people to come and join our clubs, and we find younger people through their workplaces and social networks. So again, it's not just relying on saying, we've built it, come. We go out and we find people and we invite them, because people don't just turn up at your house for dinner, do they? You invite them, you say, come spend time with me. And over the last 10 years, I think we've brought together 25,000 older and younger people. And it's not just about one visit, it's about lasting friendships. Many of those friendships have stood the test of time. And I hear older and younger people talking about subjects from racism, gender, digital. And in fact, we are helping to bridge that digital divide, particularly through COVID. We've had almost 800 older neighbours that we've helped with technical support to get them online, and so they can still dial into events on Zoom, etc.
No, so I think we've got questions when you've got a second. So do you have just one final minute, and then we'll move to questions?
Okay, I suppose that what I wanted to say finally was that what's really important is that we're not here to keep opening different Cares families. We have 5 at the moment. We're not going to open another 20 of those and keep, I don't know, Red Ruth Cares or whatever. We are grounded in the recognition that we know that it's the people in those communities that understand what it takes to thrive. It's not people in distant seats of power. So the work we're doing at the moment through our project called The Multiplier and another project called The Toolkit is about taking what we've learned and putting that power into the hands of others. And saying that this is what a 21st century connecting institution looks like. It's about bringing different people together. It's about relationships. Here's what we've learned. You now mold it to your community and make it happen in your community. And I think that's really key to how we see connection having that ripple effect across the UK. Sorry, you couldn't get me stopped once I'd started.
No, fab, really fab. And I'll make sure that some information is included on all of the Cares families work. I can't recommend it more highly. Social clubs to kind of love your neighbour schemes. It's all just epic. I think Pete, you were going to step in with a few kind of reflections, I think, because we've heard a lot in the last half an hour from our side of the pond. So it would be great to hear where your head is at, and then field some questions that I've seen in the chat.
Great, thanks, Iona. Yeah, and I did have just a couple quick reflections just for each of our great panelists here, and I so appreciate all of you, not only for your time here, but for the work that you're doing. First to John, quoted a study about alienation and loneliness, especially in ethnically diverse environments. It might be of interest in the United States. The sociologist Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, also commissioned and led another study called E Pluribus Unum. And for our friends across the pond, E Pluribus Unum, out of many one, is the US national motto. And maybe ironically, is a charge for the loneliness, against the loneliness that we're feeling, right? I mean, we should be feeling that. But what Putnam found in studying the top 40 metropolitan areas in the United States is that there was an inverse relationship between what he described as civic trust and the levels of ethnic diversity in that city. In other words, in municipalities like Los Angeles, where I'm based, or Minneapolis, or San Francisco in the Bay Area, where there are high levels of ethnic and racial diversity, there are low levels of civic trust. There were only 2 civic institutions in which he saw a positive correlation. In other words, a positive relationship between high levels of ethnic and racial diversity and high levels of civic trust across the United States. And those were in Protestant megachurches and large Catholic churches. One of the civic institutions we haven't talked a lot about here are our religious institutions. And certainly here in the United States, we have found both in their work in civic engagement, certainly in various civic missions of the church, but also just placing a higher mission upon people to draw people to, that can be a way in and of itself to draw people out of these silos that they're in, whether they be political or it can be racial or ethnic, and draw people together under a larger mission. And I just wonder how that can be a part of our conversation as well. We certainly see it here in the United States. To Ruth, we are at the American Project, and as part of this more communitarian view of conservatism and politics more broadly, also very focused on the issue of place. And it was great to hear you raise that. We have found that in some of these populist movements, which focus too much at national identity, that sometimes what gets lost is our local, more locally geographic affiliation and identity as well. That's not to say that there cannot be, as I just quoted from the Putnam study, polarization, racism, and ethnic division at the local level. But at the same time, we've found that can be a place where people can more logically affiliate, but also respond to local issues in a way that people can, it's a sense of scale that people can wrap their minds around. People know why they love where they live, in other words, without necessarily having to go to the, as the kids say, the meta level, the national level on this. And so rather than going from the national down, starting at the more local level up. And of course, in the United States, we've got a long stream of thought going back to Tocqueville, who came from across the pond and frankly taught us all that we should be thinking in a more communitarian sense. So that's a big part of what we do here. So thank you for that. And then finally, Naz, you were really going to another area where we see the intersection of policy and the issue of loneliness, and that's in the realm of agency and frankly policy devolution. What the Catholics tell us is, or give us the term subsidiarity, right? Which is this understanding that if we want people to be more engaged locally, the centralization of policymaking can work at cross purposes to that. And if we want people to be not only engaged locally to know their neighbors, but actually to have agency and power over making local policy decisions, then the policy infrastructure needs to be designed in such a way, whether it's in funding or actual devolution of policymaking to the local level, so they can have that sense of agency. And that's certainly something that we're seeing here in the United States as a challenge. We have already our sense of our principle of federalism that devolves power to the states. And what we hope and then see is that power then gets moved down even to more local levels. I can say here, even from the great state of California, there is an immense amount of diversity, even in our state, from one area of the state to the other. And empowering local communities to have that policy-making power, I think can also run counter to, or at least confront, these issues of loneliness where people feel a lack of agency. So with that, Iona, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. I have two questions, but a good host would have prioritized which one goes first. So David, I'll ask David's to start with, which Ruth has already had some comments on in the chat. But maybe this is one for you, John, because John spent quite a lot of the last few years in Whitehall, in the national corridors of power here in the UK, advising the, if I remember correctly, the UK Secretary of State for Education, but I might be wrong. And David's question, perhaps I think most probably for you at this stage, is we've all talked a lot about what we need to do. Is there a particular role for politicians here, local or national? And if so, where would you even begin?
Thanks, Anna. Yes, I do think there is. I mean, Ruth makes the point about language and listening, which I think is absolutely right. But if I frame the question slightly, what's the role for the state? Whether it's federal government, state government, or local, or more local. I mean, I think the starting point is this isn't seen, like division and loneliness isn't seen as a serious space for public policy. Mm. It's seen as a space for like nice thoughts, and there's a little bit of money left over. We could probably get a press release out of this. Let's give it to some community charities. It's a place, and like another sign of why it's not serious policy is there's no proper language. Like we talk about, we have these weird conversations about let's strengthen community. I used to run a program for teenagers to get them to mix from different backgrounds so that they could build networks and understanding to make democracy work better. And someone said to me, what are you doing? I said, I'm doing community work. And they said, great, what are you doing, like painting fences? I was like, no, I'm getting people from different backgrounds to talk to each other. Oh, I thought you were doing community work. Like the language is just useless. I mean, it's like sort of trying to paint something from a 50-foot pole. It's so imprecise. So the first thing is like we need to try and get the state to recognise, or the politicians to recognise, this is a serious space for public policy. But that means those of us who care about this need to use better, more precise language. So I talk in the book about we should have a concept like people like me syndrome, which is a clearly scientifically heavily evidenced bias we have towards people like us. We should have a clear language about what I call, I already do two of these, Owner, but the common life, which is like, I define it really carefully, which is an institution that appeals to people who see each other as different, creates an equality of status, and actually creates intense activity for people to do together. Church is often one of those. Not always, but can be. So that part of things fascinating, Peter. But we don't have a proper discussion about, well, hang on, where is the common life? Where are these common life institutions? How are they being made? Then finally, what might the government do? Well, first of all, when it's making public policy decisions, it might say, well, hang on, is this damaging or strengthening the common life? So if we're establishing new schools and you can select entirely on the basis of faith, and I say this as a person of faith, hang on a moment, what's that doing to the common life? Or if you're saying, well, actually, we're going to, in the UK, we're going to restrict benefits towards housing, someone should say, maybe that's a good idea, but bear in mind, you're going to end up with less of a common life because poorer people are going to move out of more expensive areas. Might be a good idea, but we should at least wrestle with the consequence of it. So the final thing I think we should be doing is lots of the ways that bring people together, create those common lives, can make money, right? You can run businesses that sell products or services, like, for example, cafes and lots of other institutions that do actually connect people. Where's the impact investing fund that a government puts forward to say, we're going to put some money into supporting business plans that actually, yes, make money, return investment, but actually build community? That to me would be like serious policy making, rather than here's a small bit of money to give to some charity that's got the word community in its mission statement somewhere.
Yeah, thanks, John. Peter, you earlier used the word squishy for lots of this stuff, and we at the Relationships Project say a lot, use the word fluffy a lot. Like, how do you move this from the thing that feels intangible to the thing that feels tangible? And I agree that language and other things have a role to play, but there is a question about measurement, and that's a very boring question, I think. But actually, when in the UK it comes down to commissioning services, for instance, from the government, and all they want to see is value for money, but that doesn't show up on an immediate relationship level in the measurement values, it's tough. And I wonder, as you look to move this from the kind of good to have to the essential part, from the squishy place to the concrete place, what reflections do you have from these conversations in America about, on top of what John just said, what helps you get granular and actual and get the attention of people on this subject beyond the kind of platitudes and the niceness?
Well, this is the area that I'm actually most optimistic about as it relates to the field, because this has become a cross-disciplinary issue. Whether we're looking at the economists from Princeton, Angus Deaton and Ann Case writing on deaths of despair, whether it's Vivek Murthy from the area of public health, writing on what he calls the loneliness crisis and the medical and healthcare impacts of that, whether it's the political scientists who are writing on the issues of political polarization. I quoted before the work of Ryan Streeter, who's a political scientist, and the impact that this tribalization springing out of loneliness is having on our politics and policy. Whether it's economics, health, or our politics, I think we are getting an increasingly better sense of the toxicity of loneliness and the real societal health, both individual and corporate challenges that loneliness is presenting. And so as policymakers and those that are working in communities now, I think, have a better sense, either through survey work or other analysis. Somebody, just as we were here in the midst, texted me a conversation with a leading political scientist on the issue of friendship and loneliness. And to know the people that are involved, this would not be the kind of subject that they would take up. And so I think we're definitely seeing here in the United States a growing sense of the impact of this, and one that is spurring a greater response. Here in the United States, I'll just say finally, a fairly boring federal government agency, which is now headed by US Senator Mike Lee, has created something called the Social Capital Project, which is studying the impact of economic policy and federal economic policy on issues like loneliness. And so we co-hosted an event with him and his staff on Capitol Hill just before COVID hit. And so really at all levels, both of government and also in policy research, I think this is an area where we're becoming much more aware of the specific impact of loneliness.
Great. We're just moving towards the end. So I'll only add that we're currently missing a minister for loneliness here in the UK. We got the first one appointed 4 years ago, but in the latest reshuffle, they've not reallocated it, which there are various plans to make the government feel pain. But I think the thing I've been reflecting on is how top down and bottom up is the only way that this agenda shifts, and we need political leadership, but we absolutely don't need the government making friends for us. And so
Iona, if I could just jump in on one thing, because I see the question from David Robinson about cross-discipline, also cross-party. Yes, the American project started as a way of exploring the future of the conservative movement. But what we have come to understand is there's a real communitarian movement on the left here in America as well. And there is precedent for it in the United States back in the 90s, where you saw what could be called conservative and liberal communitarians working together on policy and politics. And so part of our work, and it's so great to see the cross-party, cross-ideological perspective on this panel, is to find ways to build that, or rebuild that, I should say, here in the United States.
Thank you. So, a few closing remarks. Ruth, do you want to have a go first? You've got a minute or something to just leave the audience with a final thought.
I just want to say thank you, first of all. Thank you for the opportunity to kind of be here, but also to listen to things. It was interesting when I listened to John's book, and it was a podcast, and I was clear that possibly we were in different political spaces, but what I loved was there was so much crossover. And I think that it's about how do we move all of from the squishy and the fluffy to the powerful. I don't feel like I do squishy work. I do really good, powerful work on the ground. And it's an affront to me that my work is seen as squishy, right? But I know it is. But I feel it's about how do we find people like me who are effective at doing the work on the ground, and place me with people like John and yourselves working in a line, all of us working together with the government ministers to ensure that this work moves into a place of power. Because the point is, when it's top down, it's never affected well on the ground. It needs to be, like you said, Iona, top down, bottom up, working together. But we all need to have parity and to respect each other equally as operating different parts of the same movement. So for me, it's about how do we all move into this space and powerfully move it out of a squishy place together.
Thanks. John, do you want to go next?
I think the only thing I'll say is, building on Ruth's point, I do think we need our state governments and the state to act on this stuff, but there's stuff we can do. From looking at the last 10 people who tweeted on your timeline, and if you agree with them on everything politically, you probably need to add a couple of people you disagree with. I don't mean like people who are awful, who are trying to foment division, who are sort of beyond the pale, but I mean people who you would disagree with, who you would have to gulp about their point of view, civilly put. I mean, practicing hospitality, so once a year inviting some neighbours round for a drink. It doesn't need to be more than 2 people, but just pick them at random. Don't just pick the people who are just like you, who you feel really comfortable with. And we have Putnam, so let's end with a bit of Putnam. Join something, join a club, preferably one you don't have to pay to join, and then you'll hopefully meet some people who are a bit different from yourself. And if you hate it, leave. Just have a go.
Thanks, John. Naz, over to you.
Yeah, without wanting to repeat, agree with all the wonderful things that Ruth and John have said. I suppose I end with 3 key points. John said about we need to understand the country we live in. I think to do that, we also need to embrace change, because our country is forever changing. We always seem slightly behind with whatever level of understanding we have. So we're living in an evolving country and state. I think my second point is about the squishiness, and that, as organisations working in this space, we have an absolute responsibility to take the squishiness out and to start really putting resources into providing the evidence of our work and the difference it is making and why it is so important. And the last thing that I would say is to John's point about, what can we do ourselves? Go out there and don't wait for people to come to you. So the idea that people would just turn up at your house, invite people to talk. When you're at work and you see someone different, ask them to go out for a drink or a chat or whatever. I hear a lot of people who say the most diverse place I ever go to is my workplace, because none of those people are in my friendship circle. Put them in your friendship circle and you'll see how richer your life is.
Thanks, Naz. So I'm just going to say thank you, and then thank you to everyone for hanging around at the beginning or the end of your day, depending where you are. And thank you to Pepperdine for all of your generous hosting. And thank you to the panelists. I love challenging conversations, particularly across lines of difference. And I know we don't agree on everything, but to have had your brains in the same place, hashing these things over, is a privilege. So thank you for your time. So Peter, over to you to close.
Thanks so much, Iona. And again, I'll just add my thanks to all the panelists. And just to go back to what Ruth was making mention before, this is encouraging in the sense that I believe there is a community of communitarians that is being built. And these are people that are not doing squishy work. They're doing you're all, and I hope we are here too at Pepperdine, doing the very hard work of building communities. This is not easy. And for the reasons that we've all talked about, the real challenges that we face as political and civic cultures. And so I also want to thank all of our panelists. Just a note to all of our participants. I know we had well over 100 registrants. Everyone will get a link to the video here within 24 hours. We ask that you continue this conversation by sending around this link to folks in your networks to let them know that these conversations are happening. I look forward to more opportunities, Iona, to collaborate with you across the pond. And so with that, thanks all for your time, and let's go out and build our communities together. Thanks.